Welcome to the first revision video on agency theory. Obviously, we use agency theory to explain why we obey. So a quick reminder, obedience is defined as following orders, requests, or instructions from another individual. For example, putting away your phone when a teacher asks you to. So Milgram suggested that the instinct to obey is predisposed, it is innate, but that the differences between obedience that we see in different people is due to their socialization. So those sort of processes that they experience through parenting, through educational styles, and sort of through other experiences in their life. And from that belief, Milgram devised agency theory, where someone, when they are obeying, is acting as an agent of the person giving the order. They are acting on behalf of that individual. So as part of agency theory, Milgram suggests that we have two states, two mindsets that we can shift between depending on our interactions with others. So the first is the autonomous state. That is where we behave independently, we are aware of our own actions, we are able to take responsibility for them, and we make the decisions on how we behave. For example, even though you know not completing your homework will lead to a detention, you can choose to not do your homework and therefore face that consequence. Or you have the agentic state. In the agentic state, we have interacted with a legitimate authority figure who has given us an order, and therefore we become an agent to that authority figure. So even though if their orders conflict with our personal sense of right and wrong, we absolve ourselves of that responsibility. We take away that responsibility from us. We put that responsibility onto that legitimate authority figure, and therefore any negative consequences from the behavior that we do following their orders, we would put the blame onto that authority figure. For example, if you skip a lesson because one of your friends told you to, you would then blame them for the consequence that you get, for example, a detention, and say that you getting a detention is unfair because you were just doing what your friend told you to. Now, as mentioned, you can shift between these two states. The common shift that we talk about is the shift between the autonomous to the agentic state, that agentic shift. Now, this shift will only occur when we perceive someone to be a legitimate source of authority, and therefore we will allow them to control our behavior. Milgram will say that this agentic shift into an agentic state explains why people can commit acts of destructive obedience. For example, if you're sort of walking around the college and your headmaster tells you to put your chewing gum in the bin, you would follow that order because you see your headmaster as a legitimate source of authority because they are higher than you in that social hierarchy. However, as part of destructive obedience, we can experience moral strain. So that is that discomfort or anxiety that will be experienced only in the agentic state when a person's actions or when the actions that our legitimate authority figure has ordered us to do conflict with personal morality. For example, if we believe that harming another person is wrong, but the orders given to us by the legitimate authority figure result in someone being harmed, we would be put into this cognitive dissonance, that mental conflict that leads to moral strain. However, for the majority of people, the strain that is caused from these conflicting moral beliefs is not enough to provoke us to defy the order. So even though we might be uncomfortable with the consequences because they violate our own personal morality, we would still obey the order to cause harm or to sort of go against our moral code, as typically the binding factors are sufficient enough to cause obedience to happen. And those binding factors are just factors between you and the legitimate authority figure that lead you to listen to that authority figure. So it sort of acts as a seesaw. If the moral strain is too intense, a person would defy the authority figure despite any sort of binding factors that are there. However, if the level of binding factors experienced is greater than the moral strain, the person would obey even if those actions cause cognitive dissonance. So for agency, those are the points that you would be using for your AO1. A reminder to make sure, especially with theories, you are using examples in all of your sort of key terms that you are describing. You are explaining exactly how each key term relates to obedience and giving an example of that term. Now moving on to your AO3, you've got supportive evidence from Milgram's original 1963 study. So as always, hopefully we remember IJE structure: identify, justify, elaborate, structure to writing evaluation. You start off with identifying your point. So your point here is that Milgram's 1963 evidence shows 65% of people are willing to obey an authority figure. You then need to explain how that evidence, how Milgram's study actually supports agency theory, that justification, justify where we see that. We see that through the display of moral strain, people showing their discomfort with the action through the anxiety or the laughing, but also people showing the displaced responsibility by, during the debrief, a lot of participants saying that their behaviour was the responsibility of the experimenter. They were just following orders. And finally, you need to then explain what the impact of your justification is on our understanding of obedience, on agency theory. So with that, you need to link that back to the theory. And finally, to create a balanced argument, you'd need to demonstrate a weakness of agency theory. So for this, we are going to talk about the fact that there are individual differences that are not explained or not covered by agency theory. Agency theory says that anyone in the presence of a legitimate authority figure would obey the orders given by that legitimate authority figure. However, in Milgram's study, we see that 35% of people did not obey, even though they had exactly the same conditions as the 65% of people that did obey. Therefore, there must be some sort of differences between these individuals, such as their personality, their gender, etc. That explains why they didn't obey. Because those factors are not covered by agency theory, it shows that agency theory is an incomplete explanation for obedience. There are other factors that need to be thought about when explaining obedience completely. And thank you for watching. Obviously, if you've got any questions, please feel free to either leave it as a comment, I will try and answer it, or drop me an email, find me in class. More than happy to answer any questions.